That's all I can give you.
After everything, you're leaving me with just this?
You still have the house. You have your things. You'll be fine.
But you promised you wouldn't leave me.
Let's go. We don't have time for this.
Take care of yourself.
Her husband stood beside his new woman and handed Nadira a $100 bill, telling her the old house was all she deserved. He drove away, laughing. But he had no idea what was waiting for her inside that house. The car idled at the curb like it belonged to a different world than the one growing up around Merwick House. Weeds threading through the porch steps, paint peeling in long gray curls, a garden that had once been someone's pride gone wild with neglect. Nadira Belmont knelt on the cracked walkway, her suitcase beside her, her gray dress dusted with the dirt of a house she no longer recognized as home. Her hair had come loose from its pins hours ago, and she hadn't bothered to fix it. There didn't seem to be a point. Corvin Hale stood over her in a suit that cost more than the used car they'd shared for their first 6 years of marriage. Morel Duvain stood a step behind him, close enough to be seen, far enough to seem tasteful about it. Corvin held out a $100 bill. "You always said this house was enough for you," he said. "Now it's yours." Nadira looked at the bill, then at the house behind her, its windows like tired eyes, then back at him. "You promised we'd never forget what this place meant to us." Something in his jaw tightened, then smoothed over, the way a door closes when someone doesn't want you to hear what's on the other side. "That was before I became someone else," he turned. Morel followed him to the car without a word, because she didn't need one. Everything she wanted to say had already been said, over months, in small doses, until it became the only voice Corvin trusted. The car pulled away. Nadira remained kneeling in the dirt of a garden she used to grow tomatoes in, 17 years of her life folded into a $100 bill and an old house that needed a new roof. Corvin Hale believed he had just left his past behind him. He had no idea that the woman he'd abandoned with $100 would one day become the person he'd have to beg just to speak to. But to understand how Nadira went from that broken woman outside Merwick House to a name that would eventually mean something across an entire city, we have to go back. 17 years. They had almost nothing then. A cramped apartment above a laundromat, a mattress on the floor for the first year, and a stubborn, half-formed dream that Corvin carried around like a secret he was embarrassed to say out loud. A construction company, his name on the trucks, something built by his own hands that nobody could take from him. Nobody believed in that dream. Not the banks. Not his father, who told him men like them didn't start companies, they worked for them. Not one single person in his life, except Nadira. She worked days at a dry cleaner and took in sewing at night, her fingers pricked and raw, so that when his first attempt at a business folded before it opened, there was still something to eat. When his second attempt needed capital he didn't have, she went to the drawer where she kept the only thing of value she owned. A gold locket that had belonged to her mother, the last physical piece of a woman who died when Nadira was 19, and she sold it without telling him. He found out anyway. He always found out. He held the locket's absence like a stone in his chest and told her, voice cracking in a way she rarely heard from him, "One day I'll give you a life where you never have to sacrifice something precious for me again." She believed him, not because he'd earned it yet, but because she'd decided, a long time before that believing in him was simply what she did. They didn't marry a version of Corvin that had already made it. They built him. The years that followed were made of small, unglamorous victories that mattered more than anything that came later. A contract he got rejected for, and Nadira telling him to try again in the morning. His first employee quitting after 2 weeks, and Nadira quietly picking up a second sewing client so payroll could clear. His first real project, an office renovation nobody else wanted, and Nadira celebrating so hard in their tiny kitchen that the neighbors banged on the wall. Then came the house. Merwick House, in a neighborhood called Briar Hollow that nobody with money had any interest in yet. It wasn't grand. The floors creaked. The kitchen needed everything. But it was theirs, and they stood together in the empty living room the day they got the keys, dust motes floating in the afternoon light, and Corvin said, This is where everything changes. Nadira shook her head, smiling. No. This is where everything we survived finally means something. He told her, that same week, standing in the kitchen that would one day hold a pencil mark neither of them could have imagined the weight of yet. No matter how far we go, we'll always remember where we started. She held on to that sentence for 17 years. It would nearly break her, later, to watch him set it down like something he'd simply outgrown. His company grew the way certain things grow once they cross some invisible threshold, slowly, then all at once. One contract became 3. 3 became 10. Soon, Corvin Hale was a name people said with a certain respect in rooms Nadira had never been inside. His wardrobe changed first, then his friends. Then his weekends, which used to be theirs and slowly became meetings, dinners, rooms she wasn't invited into. At first, when he came home late, smelling like a world she didn't belong to, he'd find her still awake, and it comforted him. Here was the one person who remembered him with nothing, who wanted him regardless. Eventually, that comfort curdled into something else, something closer to shame. It was around then that he met Morelle Duvain at the opening of a development project his company had built. She was exactly the kind of woman his new world admired, poised, connected, the sort of beautiful that seemed to require no effort, which was itself a kind of effort most people never saw. She didn't attack Nadira. She never needed to. She simply noticed Corvin's oldest wound and pressed on it, gently, again and again, until it started to feel like the truth. You've built an extraordinary life, Corvin, she told him one evening, over a glass of wine he hadn't wanted to drink alone. You shouldn't have to keep apologizing for outgrowing your past. Later, more quietly, sometimes the people who knew us before we succeeded don't know how to love the people we've become. Corvin didn't leave that conversation and go home to Nadira thinking of himself as a man planning a betrayal. He went home thinking of himself as a man who had, perhaps, simply outgrown his own life. That distinction would matter to no one but him. The anniversary of the day they'd bought Merwick House fell on a Tuesday that year. Nadira made the dinner she always made. Nothing fancy. The same roast chicken from their first Christmas in the house, because some things were rituals now. Private treaties between two people about what still counted. She waited. The candles burned down. The chicken went cold. Corvin came home after midnight. He looked at the table like it belonged to a stranger's house. Do you remember what today is? Nadira asked. He didn't answer right away. Nadira, I'm exhausted. Do you remember what this house meant to us? That was a long time ago. It was such a small sentence. No raised voice, no cruelty in the tone. But Nadira understood, sitting there across from a man she'd known for 17 years, that he hadn't simply changed. He had begun the slow, deliberate work of erasing the person he used to be. And she was the last remaining evidence he hadn't succeeded yet. She didn't know it that night, but the man who once promised never to forget where they started had already begun deciding that he had to. The papers came on an ordinary Thursday, slid across the kitchen table like a business proposal. Nadira read the top line twice before the words assembled into something real. Then she asked the question she already knew the answer to. Is there another woman? Corvin didn't answer. His silence was its own confession. After 17 years? She asked, and heard her own voice from somewhere far away, calm in a way that frightened her. I never asked you to stay stuck in the past, he said. Something in her finally, quietly, snapped into clarity. I wasn't stuck in the past. I was standing beside you while you built your future. He had no answer for that. He looked for one unguarded second, like the boy from the apartment above the laundromat. And then the look passed, and he was simply a man in an expensive coat who wanted this conversation to be over. His lawyers had done their work carefully, months in advance, structuring the company in ways that made 17 years of unpaid labor. The sewing money, the second job, the locket, the 1,000 small sacrifices no court could put a number on. Legally invisible. The judge granted her the house, and a small settlement that barely covered what came next. Corvin decided, standing outside the courthouse in the flat gray light, that even that was too generous. He took a $100 bill from his wallet and pressed it into her hand. At least you have a place to live, he said. Morelle stood a few feet away, close enough to be seen. Nadira looked down at the bill. Then up at Merriwick House, visible even from here if you knew where to look, aging quietly at the edge of a neighborhood nobody cared about anymore. Corvin got in the car. It pulled away. She stood there a long time before she could make her legs carry her home. Inside Merriwick House, alone for the first time in 17 years, every room held a version of her life she could no longer reach. Their first dinner, eaten off cardboard boxes because the table hadn't arrived yet. Their first Christmas, a single string of lights because that was all they could afford. The night he proposed, badly, nervously, in the kitchen doorway. The night they danced, no music, just the hum of the refrigerator and his off-key humming filling in for a band they couldn't afford to hire. She sank onto the floor and let herself cry the way she hadn't allowed herself to in front of him. Great, ugly, gulping sobs that came from somewhere older than the marriage itself. Then, because there was nothing else to do, she wiped her face and started cleaning. It was while scrubbing years of grime off the kitchen cabinets that she noticed a faded pencil mark on the wall behind them, half hidden by a hinge. Corvin's handwriting, younger, looser, unmistakably his, N+C, W-E made IT. She touched the letters with 2 fingers, broke down again, briefly. Then, as she pulled the cabinet away from the wall to see the rest of the mark, something behind the plaster shifted. A small, unmistakable metallic sound, like a key dropping onto stone. Nadira went still. She pulled the cabinet farther out, straining against its weight, but whatever had made the sound was gone from sight, swallowed somewhere behind the old wall. She didn't know it yet, but Merriwick House had just started keeping a different kind of secret than the one she already knew it for. Before she went looking for whatever had fallen behind that wall, Nadira did something that mattered more. Though it would take her months to understand why, she learned how to survive on her own. She cleaned houses for people who used to be her neighbors. She sold preserves from a folding table at the Saturday market. Then from a small online shop, she taught herself to build out of stubbornness and library Wi-Fi. She repaired furniture she found on curbs, sanding and staining late into the night, and taught herself basic bookkeeping from videos she watched on her phone while eating dinner alone. Slowly, room by room, she began restoring Merriwick House itself. The bedroom, then the kitchen, then the garden, each repaired space feeling, strangely, like a repaired piece of herself. It was in the middle of replacing a warped window frame that a man's voice, unfamiliar and unhurried, asked from the front walk, "Did you hire someone?" She turned, startled, glass cutter still in hand. No. He studied the frame, unbothered by her surprise. Good work. Elias Rook introduced himself as a restoration architect in Briar Hollow to survey a handful of older properties the city had flagged for review. He didn't offer her sympathy. He didn't offer her money. He simply noticed, in the plain, unadorned way some people notice things that the woman in front of him was capable, and said so. It was, Nadira realized later, the first time in longer than she could remember that anyone had looked at her and seen competence instead of a problem to be solved. Elias came back the following week, this time with an old survey map spread across the hood of his truck. "Someone changed these boundaries," he said, tracing a line with one finger. "Decades ago, by the look of it. Your property on paper doesn't match your property on the ground." Nadira assumed it was a filing error, the kind of clerical nonsense that never mattered to anyone. Elias wasn't so sure, and he kept looking. She didn't think much more about it until the afternoon she finally freed the stubborn kitchen cabinet from the wall entirely and found, behind it, a narrow compartment she'd never noticed in 17 years of living there. Inside was a single brass key, old, tarnished, with no note and no explanation. She searched the house for 2 days before she thought to try the small locked door tucked beneath the staircase. A door she'd always assumed led to nothing more interesting than pipes. The key turned. Inside was a narrow room lined with the residue of another family's entire life. Old property maps, surveys gone yellow at the folds, photographs of people she'd never know, handwritten journals, legal correspondence bound with brittle string, and a sealed envelope that had waited, undisturbed, for decades. The documents told a quiet, forgotten story. The original owners of Merriwick House had spent years fighting a surveying error that had wrongly separated a substantial tract of land from the property's legal deed. Land that, by every historical record in that hidden room, still belonged to the house. And Larkhaven, Nadira learned from a city notice tucked among the papers, was in the early stages of a major redevelopment corridor running directly through Briar Hollow. The land beneath and around the house nobody wanted anymore was, suddenly, worth a great deal to somebody. But a stack of old documents wasn't a legal claim. It was only a door. Whether she had the courage to walk through it was still entirely up to her. She found an attorney willing to take the case on the strength of the paperwork alone. Some records were incomplete. Others contradicted each other in ways that would need real work to untangle. Elias, drawing on his architectural knowledge of the era, helped authenticate the survey history. Odelia Finch, a retired teacher in her 70s who lived 2 doors down and had become, almost without either of them noticing, Nadira's first real friend since the divorce, went door to door finding elderly residents who still remembered exactly where the old boundary lines used to run. Old doesn't mean worthless, Odelia told her one afternoon, nodding at the house. She said it so often about Merriwick House that it took Nadira weeks to realize Odelia had been talking about her the whole time. A developer called one evening, his voice smooth in the particular way of men who were used to getting what they wanted. "Miss Belmont, you really don't want to keep digging into that property." "Why?" she asked. "Because if those records are real," he said, "you have no idea how many people are going to want what belongs to you." She hung up and kept digging anyway. The final records came through months later, authenticated, notarized, unassailable. The land was legally hers. The offers arrived almost immediately after, first in the hundreds of thousands, then, as developers realized what they were looking at, well into the millions. It would have been easy, and no one would have blamed her, to take the money and disappear into a life free of Briar Hollow entirely. She thought of Corvin instead, of 17 years spent helping someone else build a dream while quietly forgetting she was allowed to have one of her own. She would not spend whatever came next simply selling what she'd inherited. She would build. Belmont Renewal Group broke ground on its first project within the year. Modest at first, converting a row of neglected buildings in Briar Hollow into affordable housing, a childcare center, and a training facility for women re-entering the workforce. Then a second project, a women's business incubator. A third. There was a first contract that made her hands shake signing it. A first boardroom where every person at the table waited for her to speak before they spoke. A first newspaper feature that ran her photograph beside the words "The Woman Rebuilding Briar Hollow from the Inside Out." A first introduction at a city event where nobody mentioned Corvin Hale's name at all. Because for the first time since she was 22 years old, she wasn't standing in anyone's shadow. Elias watched all of it happen without once trying to take credit for any part of it. "You didn't need someone to save you," he told her once. "No," she agreed. "But it helped, having someone who never tried to make me smaller." While Nadira built, Corvin expanded, recklessly, urged on by Morel, who had a particular gift for making enormous risks sound like inevitable ambition. He took on debt his company couldn't easily absorb. He trusted people he shouldn't have. One project failed, then another. Investors, sensing the ground shifting, began quietly pulling back. Morel protected herself first, as she always had, and then she was simply gone. No scene, no confrontation, just an absence where a person used to be. Corvin's collapse arrived in stages, the way most collapses do. The luxury cars went first, then the mansion. Then the employees who'd once called him visionary stopped returning calls. His company entered liquidation quietly, the way things do when there's no one left who cares enough to make noise about it. He ended up in a small apartment that reminded him, though he tried not to notice, of the one above the laundromat where he'd started. He was there, alone, when he turned on the television and saw Nadira Belmont being interviewed about the transformation of Briar Hollow. "Why did you choose to rebuild this neighborhood?" the interviewer asked. "Because I know what it feels like," Nadira said, "when someone decides you've become worthless." Corvin sat very still. "Sometimes," she continued, "losing everything is the first time you discover what was actually yours." Behind her, unmistakable even on a small screen, stood Merwick House, restored, its porch mended, its garden blooming again. He looked at the television, then at an old photograph, still somehow in his wallet after everything, of two people who'd once danced in a kitchen with no music. "What did I do?" he said to no one. Then he grabbed his coat. Security stopped him at the door of Belmont Renewal Group, the way security stops anyone who no longer has a name that opens doors on its own. He said he knew her. They told him she was unavailable. He waited anyway. An hour. 2. 3. Sitting on a low concrete bench across from the building's entrance while the afternoon light moved slowly across the glass. He thought, more than once, of every hour Nadira had once spent waiting for him. Dinners gone cold, anniversaries unmarked, and understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late to be useful, exactly what he was finally being made to feel. When the doors opened, she looked nothing like the woman who'd knelt in the dirt outside Merwick House. Composed, certain, not cold, simply no longer available to be diminished. He barely recognized her. She recognized him instantly. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. "I was wrong," he finally said. Then, because he owed her more than 2 words, he kept going. That he'd become ashamed of where they started, that he'd let Morel's voice replace his own, that he'd mistaken her sacrifice for weakness and his money for character, that he had abandoned the one person who had believed in him before there was any reason to. Then he knelt, right there on the pavement, in front of everyone. It was, Nadira thought, watching him, an almost perfect reversal of the image that had opened this entire story. Except this time, she was the one standing. She reached into her purse and drew out a single, carefully preserved $100 bill. Corvin recognized it immediately. She placed it in his hand. "You gave me this because you thought it was what I was worth," she said. A pause. "I kept it because that was the day I finally understood you were never qualified to decide my worth." He looked down at the bill and began, quietly, to cry. "You thought you were leaving me with nothing," she said. "You left me with myself. Can you ever forgive me?" he asked. "I already have," she said, and watched something like hope rise in his face before she finished the sentence. "But forgiveness doesn't mean I have to return to the life where I lost myself." He nodded, because there was nothing else honest left to do. He asked, before she turned to go, if there was anything he could do to make it right. She didn't hand him money. She didn't offer him a company or a title. She offered him honest work, helping renovate one of the community properties in Briar Hollow, alongside the people whose neighborhood he'd once considered beneath him. He accepted. It was, for the first time in his adult life, work he did without trying to impress a single person watching. Elias was waiting when she came back outside. He didn't ask what had happened. He only asked, "Are you okay?" She looked toward Merwick House, visible in the distance past the new buildings that now surrounded it. "For the first time," she said, "I think I am." He proposed to her there, weeks later, in the restored living room of the house that had once held nothing but debt and dust. "I don't want to stand in front of your life," he told her. "I only want to keep building beside it." She said yes. Merwick House became, in time, the Merwick House Foundation. A starting point for women rebuilding themselves after divorce, abandonment, or financial betrayal, offering temporary housing, business education, legal referrals, and the kind of mentorship Nadira herself had once had to find in a retired teacher 2 doors down. The place Corvin once thought was worth nothing more than $100 became the place where hundreds of women began again. On the anniversary of the day they'd first bought the house, all those years ago, Nadira stood outside it once more, restored now, its porch full of laughing children, women coming and going through its doors with the particular energy of people building something. Elias stood beside her. Inside, framed behind glass in the front hallway, hung a single, ordinary $100 bill, the object that had once represented the worst day of her life, now representing something closer to the first day of it. Corvin had thought he'd left Nadira with an old house and $100 because he believed that was all she deserved. He was wrong. The house was never her ending. The $100 was never her worth. And the divorce, as devastating as it was never the end of her story. It was the first day she stopped building someone else's life and finally started building her own. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who might enjoy it, and subscribe to The Quiet Verdict for more stories like this. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in her place?